we're really happy to be here as part of IFFSA's 2020 offering. It's obviously a virtual offering this year, and we're gathered for a panel to discuss one of the themes of this year's festival, which is pain of prejudice. And we've got three brilliant filmmakers with us today. We have Mr. Ali Kazmi, who's brought his film Continuous Journey about the Komagatu Maru. We've got Sami Khan and his film St. Louis Superman, and Jaskiran Singh with his film A Turban and a Beard. Thanks so much to all three of you. My name's San Graywall. I'll be moderating the panel. And thanks so much for being involved with this and participating. And I think we'll jump right into it with everyone. Mr. Kazmi, I wanted to start with you. One of the things I find quite interesting, well, there's many things I find quite interesting about your work, this film in particular, and your experiences. And I'd like you to start to tell everyone about, and if you could talk and everyone else can jump in, because I think it's sort of a universal theme. When you have been told within the industry, and the industry obviously is very vast, and it's not just the industry in one country, and it's not a mainstream or an independent industry or just a docu-industry. I mean, more broadly speaking, when you have said that people within the system, within the industry, they have told you making these sorts of films and being true to the stories that you want to tell, regardless how difficult they are, when you're confronting this kind of material, you have been told that it might ruin your career, it might make things very difficult for you. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think out of the three of us, I'm perhaps the one that's sort of the veteran here. So I come from an era when I started in the 80s when issues of race and representation were not really on the forefront. I was involved in many rounds of activism by independent filmmakers in terms of trying to open up the space for filmmakers of color and to bring diversity to the Canadian film industry. In addition to that, I was also deeply interested in issues of race and representation in my own work. And when I arrived from India to study film at York University in Toronto, I had a very profound encounter with the immigration officer who interrogated me and my colleague about the veracity of our documents, and then took us in for secondary questioning. And this was 1983, and we were kind of stunned at what was going on. And we were finally, he gave us back our papers and said, the only reason I'm letting you in because you speak such good English. And that sense, that became a really important moment for me, because it brought to me the power of gatekeeping within a system. That there are individuals who act as gatekeepers, who are empowered to act as gatekeepers, and they literally have the power to change the course of your life. And the same applies in the industry as well. There's lots of gatekeepers. There's one is constantly pitching stories. One is constantly pitching ideas. Particularly within the Canadian system, which is largely subsidized through all kinds of funding agencies. The system really hasn't changed dramatically. In this particular moment in which we are having this conversation, there are many Black, Indigenous, and people of color filmmakers who are raising their voices yet again and saying that there isn't representation, adequate representation, in the decision-making bodies that deal with, on whom filmmakers depend for their funding. And it fills me with a degree of sadness, because more than 30 years after I started, there has been a very marginal shift in the state of funding in this country. And I'll speak specifically about Canada. Now, in addition to all of that, the challenge becomes, one is faced, and I have faced additional challenges when I have sought to bring stories such as the Komagata Maru, which in effect challenge the very national narrative and mythology of Canada. And these are very difficult truths for for people to confront. And I'm not, in my films, I'm not engaging in a nation building project. I'm engaging in a nation critiquing project. And this in itself is, I knew it would be a challenge right from the beginning. It took 7 years to get that film to fruition, and lots of challenges. And, you know, it took so for 7 years, I went to TV Ontario, for example, and they kept saying, for 6 years actually, and they kept saying, no, we don't want to do this project. And finally, on the 7th year, they said, okay, we've got a directive to bring more diversity to our programming. And the directive, there literally was a directive from the then CEO of TV Ontario, who said, we need to broaden our the offerings that we have in terms of cultural representation.
Which year was that shift?
This was well, this wasn't a shift, I would say. This was a particular moment. I wish there was a shift. This was in 2000. I finally cracked the door open in 2003. So that you know, not that long ago. And even then, the discussions that went on in terms of the nature of the film and what was going to be in the film were deeply problematic. And the film was not very liked by the powers that be at the time. So there are lots of ongoing systemic challenges.
Mr. Khan, I wanted to ask you what Ali was just talking about, and going back to 2003 and the early 2000s, the 90s. Your film, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was Al Jazeera or you for some sort of a film to look at electoral reform and to look at other kind of broad systemic action that could address some of the problems that we began seeing. Obviously, you know, your film focuses on a lot of what's happened in Missouri after Michael Brown's death, and the election of Mr. Franks to the Missouri state legislature. Do you think that what Ali was just describing in terms of the industry, more on the film side of things, have you seen, I use the word shift. Ali was pretty quick to say, no, it was just a blip. It was just basically like one moment in time, as if to say nothing systemic has really changed. It's pretty much the same. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, he's right. I think I'm in a sort of somewhat unique position where I work in the United States and I also work in Canada, but I've spent most of my career, the last 10, 15 years, working in the United States. Yeah, I think Ali's right. I think, you know, even now at this watershed moment, media companies in Canada and institutions like Telefilm are talking about studying the issue of diversity. Let's have a task force to look at this, to figure out what we're going to do, if we're going to do something. Let's put together a committee or a website that has a resource of people of color. That time is gone. You know, that time is decades ago. There are people dying in the streets. You know, we have the transformation of Western democracies into fascist white supremacist states. These media executives who are thinking that they can study this are just totally out to lunch. You know, I mean, I have to be blunt about it. And I think in Canada, the problem is much more egregious, because in the United States, there are downsides to the market, right? It looks a kind of capitalistic Hollywood arts system. But one of the good parts is that it answers to an audience. And the audiences in the United States aren't going to stand for the same stuff. They're not going to stand for stories about, you know, South Asians that don't involve South Asians as the core team, stories about African Americans that don't involve African Americans. But in Canada, that stuff is still going on. And the part of the problem is, like Ali said, it's like there's so much government money, government support into not just like the public system, like TV Ontario and the National Film Board and Telefilm, but private broadcasters, right? Like CTV, they're using government money. And there's a real, I don't know, it's almost like a curtain that you can't penetrate, that you can't get accountability to it. So I mean, it's kind of Kafkaesque, to be honest. It's like, who is the person making the decision? And so it's much harder to reform. It's much harder to change. And that's why things like reform are limited, because to be honest, we live, like Ali was saying, we live in a sort of colonial state. Even us as immigrants and the descendants of immigrants, we're colonists in the Americas, in Canada. And so we need to talk about the fact that just stating it out there, that Canada is founded on land that was taken from its indigenous peoples. There needs to be a reckoning about that. And I also would remind us too that this conversation, this moment in 2020, was initiated by the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, their murders in Ahmaud Arbery. So that legacy of anti-Black racism and the way the wealth of this continent was built on anti-Black slavery is really important. And I think for a filmmaker who's made a film about an African-American man, I have to be honest that it's his story. Even this mode of documentary filmmaking, it's his story. And but again, like, I think that in the U.S., it's interesting to just compare the systems. And to be honest, I don't know how you change Canada other than like somebody firing a significant slew of executives, to be honest, in Canada, and starting again. And having more accountability to this new crop that is more reflective of Canada in the 21st century.
Just Karen, for yourself, a Canadian filmmaker, but you do a film that's set in Wisconsin. It's a documentary based on the horrific mass shooting in 2012 in August in a suburb of Milwaukee at a Sikh Gurdwara. 6 people were killed, 4 were injured. A 7th victim who died of his wounds, complications due to the injuries he sustained. He passed away earlier this year. For you, a couple of things I wanted you to touch on. What Sammy was just talking about in the context that a lot of the global attention has been sparked by, the Ahmaud Arbery, the Breonna Taylor, but most significantly the George Floyd murder. How do you address South Asian issues and intolerance and systemic racism and what many segments of the South Asian community experience around the world, even in India, even in the subcontinent? How do you take what's happening and what was sparked from the reality that faces African Americans and apply that to a lot of clearly what you think about vis-a-vis the South Asian context?
So I, like Sammy, who works in the U.S. and Canada, I grew up in New Jersey, and I spent my formative years down there. So I was there when 9/11 happened, and I was there up until about 10 years ago. So the short kind of comes out of that experience of seeing kind of the tides change. But to your question, I feel like, yes, George Floyd and that the anti-Blackness that America is very clearly founded on, we are founded on. We as in any immigrant in either continent, we are kind of bearers of that in the sense of how immigration works in the civil rights movement, and how my parents and how everybody kind of gradually made their way over to America. We're a part of that. And we're also equally as, I think, guilty as a culture sometimes of feeding into it, because we would much rather be accepted than be othered. And so as a result, I feel like we tell our kids, or we tell our society, or we tell our communities that, like, hey, as long as we're not the ones in the scope, right? As long as we're not the ones who, they're chasing while we're jogging and killing us, I think that's enough. And that's not enough in the sense of, we've had our own members of our community be killed in similar ways, if not by the authorities, but by hate crime in general. So I think it's a watershed moment to understand kind of all of that, all of our roles in that, of how it's been going on, and understand what role we play in that, and how we move forward, and how we support, like, equally support South Asian narratives, but equally understand that we have to uplift similar stories in other communities, because we're all kind of joined by that common need to be our voices to be heard.
And I'd just like to pick up on that. And what I really appreciated about Sami's film was that, you know, we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of anti-Blackness within the South Asian communities, right? And we are often, in fact, the South Asian community, particularly in the States, is held up as a model minority in a way that that is very problematic, and is, you know, and that narrative of a model minority is used to absorb the community into this notion of white superiority, and therefore act as a bulwark against Blackness. And there is a lot of anti-Blackness within the community. So I think what Sami does, just by the act of making the film on a remarkable Black activist, is to shatter that inner wall in a way. And you know, and it's also interesting. I mean, I'm curious to talk to you, Sami, about this. What was the response? I know that Al Jazeera approached you, or did you pitch the project to Al Jazeera, and what was their response for you as a South Asian doing a film about a Black activist?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a kind of organic process. First, thank you, Ali. That's very kind of you. And I mean, I should throw it back to you, the way you interrogate the narrative. I think that's really inspirational. And so I hope to, you know, keep carrying that torch of interrogating challenging the narrative, whether it's in Canada, the United States, India, South Asia, because that's what we need to do. That's how the powerful are able to disenfranchise the marginalized. But actually the process of making a film about Bruce was very organic. You know, there's an incredible commissioning producer at Al Jazeera English named Posi Tang, who's now a good friend, like my sister now, and who's in charge of the Americas. And she found my co-director and myself and liked our work and wanted to work together. And, you know, we looked for a while, and, you know, Sam was talking about this earlier, we're looking at some story around the transition from street protest into electoral politics. You know, this is like around 2017, I think it was. So Bernie's first campaign against Hillary, you know, AOC hadn't been elected. That pivot point hadn't quite happened. So we were looking to politicians who might be like that. And Smriti, my filmmaking partner, had found Bruce's story, read it in like a St. Louis Post-Dispatch article, and it, you know, Bruce's story is just mythic, right? Just like almost like a superhero. I mean, like a superhero, the way he, you know, suffered tragedy as a young man, as a boy, and then was able to overcome that and has these super heroic rhetorical and storytelling skills. So it was very organic, and we're fortunate that we didn't have to pitch. I mean, we did have to pitch them because we had to sell them on the idea that this was a film we could make a 27-minute film about him and lay out the story. And then it was somewhat unusual, and then once we found some success, we got into Tribeca and got a jury mention there. Then MTV came on board and sort of licensed the film for the US. And, you know, to be honest, that's why we had such a push and, you know, ended up at the Academy Awards, was because of the muscle of Viacom. And I mean, it's an interesting process where, you know, Bruce is someone who really confronts and challenges the system. And I don't know if like the tension is resolvable, where you have this powerful media entity who has been, you know, in some ways complicit in anti-Black racism, and yet they're promoting this film with this insurgent politician. So again, like, I don't think that's reconciled to this day with some of the conversations, but the window you get, and, you know, I don't know if for the three of you too, if you can, if this makes sense to you, but like these powerful institutions are made up of people. So it's almost like as an activist, as an artist, you want to like find the allies and sort of separate them so that you can co-opt the system to affect change. And that's how St. Louis Superman really got made and made the impact that it did.
You know, what's interesting?
Ali,
yeah.
Ali, I wanted to talk to you. You spoke a little bit about the gatekeeping role and, you know, your feelings about that in Canada. I think we should bring a lot of this back to Canada. Um, when you speak about the industry, and clearly, it sounds like from, hearing from all of you, there's challenges and there has not been the type of progress that we probably should have seen. Like these sort of things, to me, really should have been addressed, quite a long time ago, probably back in the 80s is when, after the Multiculturalism Act and a lot of changes to the education system within the media. Well, the media, is another institution that, very similarly has a lot of problems in terms of lack of representation. But moving the industry and other industries aside, in terms of the reality in our society in Canada, a lot of people have been saying to me in the last few years, but certainly in the last couple of months, regarding everything that's happened. And we know that, for every George Floyd, there's a, Dondre Campbell, there's a Jermaine Carby, there's a Canadian example. They just haven't had as much attention. And one of the things I wanted to ask all of you, but in Canada, why do you think it seems like in the last few years, or perhaps half a decade, I don't know when we could really pinpoint a point in time, but why does it seem that we're going backwards on these issues of intolerance? So moving away from the industry and the filmmaking, but the reason why the filmmaking is so important to get at these issues and these realities, why are those realities going in the wrong direction? Obviously it's going on around the world, but let's speak about it in a Canadian context.
Sure. So one of the things that we haven't had in Canada is a real reckoning with colonialism. And I don't mean colonialism in the past tense. I mean colonialism that is ongoing now. Canada, as Sami has pointed out, is a white settler state. It was imagined as a white settler state. And the notion of a white settler state was reinforced for 100 years, from 1867, from the point of Confederation, to 1967, when all references to race and nationality were finally dropped from the Immigration Act. Right? So from 1968 onwards, Canada sought to reimagine itself. But in its reimagining, it has also deliberately chosen to take on this amnesia about its white supremacist past. But the past stays with us. The past is not in the past. It is the present. And we can't move forward till we continue to confront the white supremacist underpinnings of the Canadian state, and not just of the Canadian state, but and I don't use white supremacy, just to be clear, I don't use white supremacy to invoke the KKK or some white supremacist fringe group. I mean the notion of white supremacy that led to colonization and genocide on this continent, and the subsequent settlement, and then the bringing of Africans as slaves to build this world-class economies of both countries. That has not been confronted. So what happens is that there are moments where there is a sudden groundswell of expectant change, but there is no intention, and there are no mechanisms put into place that will sustain that momentum, right? And this is my concern with this, even with this historic moment at this time, that there is everyone right now, and just about 3 days ago, there was a massive similar conference, a Zoom conference on systemic racism in the Canadian film industry. And that's all well and good. That was an initiative taken for this particular time, but it's still, I'm still waiting for a sustained commitment over the next 5 years or 10 years that is clearly outlined. It is not good enough to say that we're going to be taking more interns. We're not talking about change at the level of interns or apprentices here. The time for that is long gone. So coming back to more directly to your question in terms of, are we going back? In some regards, I think the status quo has remained, and part of the way we see the status quo maintaining itself in Canada is the continued violence against Indigenous people and Indigenous communities, right? Which is unrelenting. It has not changed. And then we see it manifests itself in the police violence against Black men across the country. And we see it in small ways in terms of ongoing acts of systemic racism against people of color in all walks of life. The only way to confront this requires us to maintain a kind of a sustained momentum. And that is very hard to do. That is extremely hard to do because it takes a toll on you in doing that. Right? And there are waves of activists that come in, people get burnt out, people get tired, but the system continues to maintain itself. So what all of us are doing, and that's why I'm really happy to be on this panel with Sami and Jess, is that we're all trying to use our art to hold up a mirror to both Canada and the US and to say, this is what's happening, and this is from our perspective.
I used to say,
Karen, I'd like to speak,
Yeah.
ask you a couple of things. And I think everyone jump in because this is something that I'm sure all four of us can relate to. You know, we're guilty of something on this panel. It's something quite glaring, right? We have no women that are on this panel, right? Typical South Asian conversation about something that's very impactful and whatnot. And yet, I don't think that's any fault of IFFSA or Sunny's who organized this. It just sort of played out that way. But I wanted to touch on something. Within the communities that we all relate to, so we're more broadly all part of the South Asian diaspora. You know, I'm of a Sikh background, just Karen, same with you, Sunny Ali and Sami. I think I don't know if you're practicing, but you know, you might identify yourselves, maybe you don't, maybe you might be secular, but Muslim. I'm not sure if you trace your roots back to India or Pakistan or where it might be, but we're all, you know, more broadly South Asian, we could say. And in that milieu and in that dynamic, whether it's, you know, not allowing female voices and female representation, whether it's our own caste and class marginalization within, you know, our communities, whether it's the inability for our communities to accept and understand the role that arts, you know, the arts and film and literature and, you know, books and even academia, what the importance that they play in expressing these narratives, telling these stories, giving root so that future generations actually have a body of storytelling, something to go back. You know, there are a lot of communities I look at around the world, I'm not going to name them in particular, who do a wonderful job of accepting and grasping the arts, grasping, for example, film. They recognize the power. It's elevated within their communities. There are people who get involved in funding it. The private sectors that are connected to those communities see the importance of it. Just Karen, talk to me about what needs to be done to elevate film in particular, because that's the medium that all three of you work in, but to get it to be more well-rounded, to be more embraced, to get our communities to a point where things like film and what film can do that no other medium can do. What are your thoughts about how this needs to change?
So it's a good question. In the sense of the South Asian community, I find that it's interesting in both, I guess, good and bad ways that we're on a panel that is called Pain and Prejudice, right? And all of our pieces speak to that. But what I used to do a bit where I would say that's why are those all of our stories? Like, how come we're only ever listened to when it is pain and prejudice? And like I said, equally guilty, right? My entire short film should just be called Pain and Prejudice. And it's the idea of when we go to these gatekeepers within our community even, and say like, I have an idea for this, or I want to do the art, or I want to do something and really express myself. It's unfortunate sometimes that like this is my debut as a director, and I used to joke about the fact that this had to be my debut because it was the easiest thing I could explain to my parents. it was the easiest way that I could justify all this time that I've been, you know, writing and directing and working.
Yeah, like if you were pitching Harold and Kumar to your parents,
right? Yeah. I mean, Jersey represent there, but like, it's the idea of like, I've done other things, but I felt like, you know what, at this juncture, I will get the least amount of pushback if it's a story about our community. It's a story that they would understand without any questions. But something I look forward to working on and I want to push the narrative on is the harder stuff, the things that if you bring up, you know, domestic violence or you know, sexism or within our own racism, if you bring that up, these are conversations that growing up, we weren't allowed to question. And when you question them, it was kind of like, just go away. When you asked about what film can do, I think it first and foremost has to do the uncomfortable thing, which is hold up that mirror and say, look, you want us to do the, you know, the turn off your brain and have a good time movies? Yeah, we can't get in the door to do those because they still want to see the pain movies. But for the sake of the community, I think we need to show them that we don't have conversations in our communities. We need to start having tough conversations. And if films can, it sounds cliche, but if films can open that door of, okay, does this happen in your family? Do you know somebody who's been through this? And chances are you do, and your family does, and it's either brushed under the rug or just not mentioned. And I think we need to open that door first and foremost. And then we can get, you know, more of the answers that we seek. But as far as the industry is concerned, it's the same thing of, I would have a much easier time, and it's unfortunate, pitching something like this because it would just by virtue of history have never been done before. So like, I guess that's great. It's novel. And then it wasn't done before, but it's like, well, now I did it. Now can I do something? No, then they're just going to push you aside and say, hey, bring up the next tragedy. And that's not like, that's what kind of cycle is that perpetuating of, if I can say that since I was a kid, I never saw, you know, a man in a turban ever depicted in any way that was, you know, not stereotypical or not related to the fact of, hey, let's get a one-off joke or a one-off stereotype in there. If I've never seen that, it's 2020. If I want to see that change and we see it once, great, I'm proud of it. But that, I don't need that to be a one-off. That's not like what we're doing right now. Like Ali was saying, is we're having these moments of one-offs because we think, is that what you want to hear? Are you okay with that? Are you okay that we got X, Y, and Z in a room, but we're not giving them that voice. We're not giving them the opportunity. I should be able to go in there and pitch a terrible movie and somebody should like it, and it should not matter, you know, who the main characters are or whatever. But that's what I find that we, as far as the community is concerned, we're still on like ground level of, we can't even break the barrier of, is this a valuable profession? Is this a profession in which we can do it? And then all growing up, I would give out examples of, hey, X has done it, Y has done it. And they would just go, oh, that fluke, it's a fluke. That person's a fluke. And I remember like, I wanted to grow up and be a journalist. And for the life of me, I could not for the longest time pinpoint a South Asian journalist. And when I finally got into college, I was a big fan, still am, of Fareed Zakaria. And I would go, Fareed Zakaria, Indian man, journalist. I know you guys watch GPS. You guys watch him on TV all the time. Even that level was still like, oh, well, one person. And we're constantly bucking up against that idea of, we know, like, our families know people. They don't know them, but like they know there's enough out there now that you can't be ignorant to it. But there's still that innate shame of, not my kid, not my, like, I don't want you to do this thing because you're not either welcome or I don't, you know, justify it. But I've always said that if I won an Oscar tomorrow, no offense, Sammy, nominated. My parents were really proud I was going to be on this panel with somebody who was nominated for an Oscar. So we're making small strides. But it's that idea of that could happen, and that would change maybe my innate four walls structure of, oh, good for you. And it brings people out of the woodwork. But I would still imagine no one's going to go to their kid and say, did you see Jaskaran won an Oscar? You could do that too. It's going to be like, hey, you focus on your thing. Don't be like that guy over there. We're still cautionary tales, and I don't understand that on some level.
Sammy, I wanted to talk to you. Just for everyone who's watching the panel who doesn't know, Sammy's film, St. Louis Superman, was nominated for an Oscar this year in 2020. Huge accomplishment. Congratulations on that. As you've heard on the panel, you probably get this a lot. When the nomination came out, I imagine you were inundated by messages, congratulations, all the pressure, the weight, expectation. You internally, I'm guessing, you've had a lot of thinking, like, I'm sure this is the way this works, right? Like, wow, this changes everything. When you think of all of the pressure, all of the expectation, all of the responsibility suddenly on your shoulders, maybe you hadn't anticipated it. A filmmaker, an actor actually once said to me, we all kind of dream about that Academy, that Oscar acceptance speech. Like, we all think about, like, wow, the pinnacle is when we get the award, we're on the stage, and we're delivering that Oscar acceptance speech. I wonder, with the nomination, which is, pretty much as good as winning it, right? I mean, you've been singled out amongst thousands of films as one of the finalists. It's just a huge, huge compliment. What does it do for you now? The theme of this panel, some of the other themes, being a South Asian individual, what does it do in terms of the pressure? Like, do you now use this opportunity to take a step back and say, God, like, what do I want to make? What films should I be approaching? What themes, what narratives, what storytelling, is on my plate now when you have all of those expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I thanks to my wife and my family, I'm a pretty grounded person. I'm also, I don't know if I ever thought I would be nominated for an Academy Award. So, I mean, in terms of me, it hasn't really changed me. On the other side, it has made things tremendously easier, at least now, at least in the short term, to have conversations about the stories that I want to make. And I think the other thing that's happened is there is this window that, because of people in the streets in Minneapolis, in Portland, in Toronto, in Halifax, wherever they are, pushing the narrative, doing the real work, these gatekeepers at institutions for this moment in time are open to the stories that do challenge the narrative. So right now, I'd say it makes things tremendously easy, even if it's just from like addressing like structural bias in the industry, where you're wondering, am I getting paid the same amount that my white counterparts are for this position? For a woman, it's doubly so. So I think that helps, being nominated for an Academy Award. It's like, pay up. you're paying for an Academy Award nominee now, and it's like, I'm not just some brown guy you can ignore. And then on the other side, it's like pitching stuff. The people who have seen our film because of the Academy Awards are incredible. I mean, and I think it's also sort of going back to what I was talking about decision makers at powerful institutions. It's also, one of the most surreal aspects of the whole process was kind of befriending Mark Ruffalo. It was almost like a kismet, where we ran into him during the sort of the grind of promoting our film, and he was promoting a film. And I literally accosted him and introduced him to Bruce. And then he's on a short list. Maybe Michael B. Jordan would be above Mark Ruffalo, no offense, Mark. But like, then we saw him on the Oscars, and the way him and Bruce embraced on the red carpet was like a fairy tale. And, and then ultimately all of the publicity, all of the films are only useful insofar as we can talk about the issues that they raise, right? That we can talk about pain of prejudice, that we can talk about these structural biases, challenging the South Asian diaspora, but also challenging the dominant culture, the white culture. So it's again, I'm like a pretty grounded person. It's like not going to go to my head, because partly I'm so hard on myself, and it's like never good enough, but I also want to just keep doing the work. I want to keep pushing things, and I know time is precious, and I want to make sure I'm not taking for granted the long arm of history is going to bend towards justice. It might not. Look how dark things are right now in the United States, in India, in Brazil, even in Canada. Like, one of our chief exports is YouTube fascists. So we just have to keep hustling. We have to keep working. We have to keep being good allies to each other and not, sweeping out each other's legs. We have to just keep hustling and building sustained change. So, so I mean, basically they stop killing us, right? It's like, shouldn't be so hard. Like, stop killing us. Why is that so revolutionary? Stop being a racist. But like, we're still struggling. We can't even like get one side of the argument to agree on that. And so we just got to keep pushing.
On the theme of pain and prejudice, confronting intolerance, xenophobia, systemic barriers, trying to lift such large segments of our society, our neighbors, our community members, up from, the oppression that's, held them down for so long. When all of you do your work, I am wondering, and Jaskiran, you touched on it, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? You don't want to be pigeonholed as, the visible minority filmmaker who only writes about oppression of visible minorities and intolerance. That's the only theme you're allowed to participate in. You'd love to maybe you want to make a romantic comedy. Maybe you want to make a suspense film. Maybe you want to make an action thriller or a superhero film. And is it a case where, like Black Panther, it just involves, and a lot of, a lot of female directors who I think are doing some of the greatest work, and this doesn't apply to just Hollywood or in India or in Canada, wherever. And one of the reasons why I wonder if some of the best work being produced nowadays is by female filmmakers is because they recognize that you can do both. You can do the superhero film, but address, like Black Panther, some very, very broad systemic problems. And if you are a master, if you really, really get good at your craft, that flexibility, that gymnastic ability to sort of use the genre in the ways that it can be used, reach a wide audience, have it be as entertaining as possible. But at the same time, those who understand how to address the themes that are truly valuable, the most important stories to tell, the things that will have a legacy, that will make an impact. Can you speak, all three of you, and I won't ask in any particular order, can you talk about the importance of getting young filmmakers, visible minorities, women, whomever they might be, to the point where their craft is second to none, but then they also bring with them more of that social responsibility kind of mindset?
I think, if it's okay if I go first, I think I feel like we've used the word shift here, but I feel like we never really got the shift we were trying to get. But the idea of, I think that the standards once upon a time were such that if for the sake of, if any minority got to helm a big picture or whatever it was, if you got that honor, if you will, that was this new standard. If a person of color, a minority, a woman, if they could helm a picture with a big blockbuster cast and it made a lot of money, that was the first checkpoint. If we did that, great, we're doing great things. And I think I was of that ilk growing up, in that felt like, isn't that the dream? You want to be an equal on that level, and you don't really think about it in terms of, well, what am I perpetuating the problem? And I think now we're at more of what you're saying, which is, not only are we helming these things, we need to make the conscious effort to bring the community to the forefront of it, not in a preachy way, and not in this is all I do kind of a way, but just to make it seem normal and be at the kind of height of your craft. And that's something where I've had to reconcile with the idea of, well, what I write and what I direct, are the characters in it, are they South Asian? Are they minorities? Are they people of color? Are they women? And it's just the idea of what that should just be a normal thing. I'm not pandering to anything, or I'm not pivoting to any demographic. I'm just saying this is what the story that I'm trying to tell. And by doing so, if you're being, natural and nuanced about it, everything that you're saying about balancing that, the innateness of the concept plus any, subtlety or any of that stuff in it. I think it comes across naturally because we're allowing them to just be. Whereas before, I think we were boxing ourselves into, well, yes, I check off the diversity box, but I want to make the most generic thing because that's the standard. And now you're allowed to kind of be more nuanced with it, and that's how I think it goes forward. That makes sense. I don't know if that made sense.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to jump in?
Well, I've spent, the last 3 decades trying to do a bunch of things, and also trying to, at the same time, make films not just about the South Asian community. I've done 2 projects on the Indigenous community. I'm currently working on a feature doc about an Indigenous group that was declared extinct by Canada in 1956, and it's always a challenge to present those views, because white filmmakers in some ways are given the privilege of going anywhere in the world, making a film on any subject and not being questioned for it. Right? No one's going to ask a filmmaker, well, why did you go to Bolivia to do a film that's about an Indigenous man trying to save an observatory on top of a mountain? But I would be asked the question, well, why did you, as somebody from India who's living in Canada, choose to make a film about a Chinese American family in Chicago in the 1930s? Which is precisely what happened to me. So I think in terms of young people, I teach as well. As you know, I teach film production at York University, and one of the things that hasn't changed for young people, and it's so important, and once again, I find myself as a role model, is that there are very few instructors of color across the country teaching film production. So even when filmmakers come in, whether they be South Asians, from any other community of color, they are entering into a world that is still very white in terms of what they're being taught. So in terms of their own journey of finding their voice, it becomes an ongoing challenge. And I have seen the importance of role models, of people that seeking someone to emulate. Jaskiran mentioned that in terms of his own journey of wanting to be a journalist and finding no one there that he could point out to his parents or look up to and see what had happened, how they'd gotten there. So I think it's a part of an ongoing process.
Yeah, Sammy, your thoughts on what we were touching on in terms of you perhaps more so than anyone participating today, might have these opportunities now, and have you thought a lot about if you think about your powers as superpowers, how do you want to use them?
Yeah, I think I'm cognizant of the fact this historical moment that the way the market works, right? It's like companies, sports teams posting black squares after the death of George Floyd. Take that with a grain of salt. Take the meetings of this studio or this executive really wants to talk to you because they don't know any people of color and they want, like Ali's saying, they need to figure out what projects they're going to tell. So it's like for filmmakers of color, it's a dangerous bind, right? You can, on the one hand, be co-opted and objectified, but then you can also be use diversity as like a marketing tool, as this is like, this big budget film, and like Jaskinder was just saying, it's like this big budget film directed by a person of color, but does it actually investigate white supremacy? Does it investigate militarism or the legacy of exploitation, of immigrants, people of color, you know, or is it just a big dumb action film? So I think that's fine. I think people of color can make those movies, right? They should obviously be able to make those terrible movies and, you know, that people love and go see them. But then it's another thing if you're using diversity to sell yourself, right? Or to sell a film. And I think that's what we're seeing now, which kind of alarms me, the way these major studios are using diversity to sell films as kind of a cudgel to beat over the head of some members of the audience, because then it puts people who are activists, it puts filmmakers and artists who are actually doing the work in a really difficult position, because then the right and the far right can say, well, like, Disney's just selling this, you're just all with Disney, right? But like, if Canada turns into a fascist state tomorrow, we know what side the corporations are going to be on, most of them, right? They're not going to, you know, continue this forever. It's just now because it's marketable, because these activists have harnessed in brilliant ways TikTok and social media and years of creators on the inside slowly affecting change. So I'm just cognizant of that, like this dangerous moment to do justice to a movement that's larger than myself.
We're going to wrap up pretty soon, but the last thing I want all of you to touch on, and Sammy, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to thank everyone right now for participating on behalf of IFFSA. It's just great to hear all of your thoughts on all of this. And then we're going to end it off on this last note. And Sammy, I'll get you to start, but I'd like everyone to comment on this. What's the role of the audience? What do you think? You've touched on a lot of it. Sammy, what you were just saying, a lot of that does come down to the audience. You know, is there a market for the types of films that provoke and challenge and confront? If they're done in the right way, does it come down to the craft? Does it come down to the skill of the writers and the producers and the directors to be able to reach the audience? So it's up to you to use your skills and your craft to reach and to develop a relationship with them, telling these types of stories. Talk to me about the audience and their responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is something that is a distinct problem in Canada. Being privy the last couple years to conversations about the audience in Canada. And I know that a lot of executives have the assumption that the audience in Canada is homogenous. It's like Mike in Red Deer or whatever, you know. They don't understand that in the last 10, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, Canada's been under huge demographic changes. Not just do we have a responsibility to our Indigenous peoples to reflect their stories because we took the country from them, and our Black Canadians because their ancestors built this continent and the wealth, but also with South Asians, why is it in politics? You look at the House of Parliament and you see all of these South Asians in Parliament, right? Because South Asians can get out there and hustle, they can raise money, they can connect to people. And then you turn on TV and there's like, where are the South Asians? There's like one character on a show. There's a show a decade that lasts for a couple of years. So I think Canadian audiences need to demand that the broadcasters tell stories that reflect them. And there's a continuum of action they can take from, you know, active boycotts to just not watching stuff. But they can also demand, like I was saying earlier, that creators, if we're talking South Asian creators, but also, you know, other people of color are actually the ones who are telling those stories. And I think that's something that audiences in Canada have a responsibility to. And, you know, for me as a creator, I have a responsibility to tell a good story, so that once that opportunity is there, that the show doesn't suck, you know. But I think that the audience also can help us out by pushing, making sure that these companies like Bell and Chorus are accountable for what they're doing, because again, it is government money that they're using to produce Canadian content in this country.
Yeah, I can tell you a story about audience and how the audiences are perceived. And Sammy, you know, what you're talking about, the perception of the gatekeepers in terms of what Canada is and what the Canadian audience is. So in 2005, I did a film. It was a film called Runaway Grooms. It was an investigative film that looked at the process of where some men of Indian origin had gone back to India, particularly Punjab, and had got married, taken large sums of dowries, and then abandoned their wives and come back and filed for divorce. So I found two women who in India who were willing to go on camera to share their story. One of the women and her parents spoke to me in Hindi, and the discussions around the table with the commissioning editors were nothing short of surreal. I was told that I had to do a voiceover, have actors do an English voiceover for the people speaking in Hindi. I said I refuse to do that because there are close to 1 million people in this country who understand these women in their own language without subtitles. And the film, in a way, gives them their voice. Therefore, I refuse to interject, put another filter on their voices, which is the English voiceover. And their response to me with a straight face was, I wish they would watch us. I'll never forget this moment because I was so enraged. I said, I am one of them and I watch you, but you have no idea that I'm watching you. And this is exactly your problem. But just that moment of the issue of subtitling became such a contentious point that I was punished for holding on to that. My payments were stopped for 3 months, but we still, in spite of that, we got the second highest ratings for a documentary that year. And then the film won the top Canadian prize, which is at that point was the Gemini award called the Donald Britton Prize for Best Social Political Documentary. But my point being that the audiences do speak. The audiences, the word gets around, especially in this age of social media, if word gets around that there's a cool show with South Asian characters or Chinese Canadian characters, people will come to it, and that will be reflected on the ratings. The problem is this imagined Canada that is imagined in its whiteness that still continues to persist. And that is the problem. I don't, audiences are I also don't put the entire responsibility on any work of art needs an audience to complete the work. Without an audience, a piece is just sits in a vacuum and is never in effect complete.
I'll just get Just Karen maybe to jump in then. And Just Karen, your thoughts again, where do you see things? Like, are you seeing an audience that's developed, let's say in North America, that's more amenable, that seems to demand, we talked about earlier, I can't remember who said it, might have been you, Just Karen, that, there are more people, or perhaps it was Sammy that said it, there's more and more people demanding real stories. We don't want the Disneyfication, of our world. What are your thoughts on all this?
I don't think we're wrong in that the audience is demanding it, but demand is only as good, I think, as what we inundate the market with. So I 100% believe there's demand, but I also almost 100% see that demands aren't being met, or they're being met with something that's more of like, oh, hey, we heard you wanted this, this type of show, so we made it. We burned it off. So that general sense of the demand is there, but like, think of it, Canada's an industry that if you walk down the street and ask Canadians what, a Canadian film is, they couldn't tell you, like we are inundated as an audience to think that we, as a contributor of world cinema, we don't exist or we don't value it. So why is that? Because when I've filled out those applications where I've tried to get Canadian cinema to be created, and if it doesn't take place in Western Canada in the mountain range somewhere with a white protagonist. Good luck getting it. Like they don't see the value in it. Or again, you have to go back to like, hey, I'm sad, let me tell my story. So that the audience is there, but like I think Sammy was saying earlier, I think we would all agree that as much as we want our content to be seen, I think, and then Ali said it beautifully about role models. I think we all want to be at a stage, and I hope, like, Sammy, I feel like we'll definitely do that to lift up of I got here and now I will help other people get to a similar or higher level, so we can change the process of if the boardrooms and the executive rooms and all of those rooms, so much as have one, the conversation drastically changes. It's going to be tough, but it drastically changes where somebody can say, hey, why do you think that's okay? Or, hey, have you ever considered this aspect? Or, hey, you could avoid a lot of bad press if you just think about this. And just that change of who gets into the room, and then as a result, what gets greenlit, what gets made, what gets heard, how many times people have pitched things to me or as if I'm nobody, to just go, hey, that's really interesting. So why is it that certain things just, it's a filter. I've heard so many times people go, oh, that's really interesting, but we're not looking for it right now. And well, when are you going to look for it? You're not going to look for it. We need people in there to say, oh my God, that's very unique and that's very different. And like we were saying, why is it so hard for a country to back itself up as this mosaic and be so proud of it? I think that's the big disservice that Canada does, is Canada has some sort of inferiority complex with, it's so much easier to say, we're not America, those guys are crazy down there. It's so much easier to say their problems are their problems, and there's no way we can suffer that up here, because it's so much easier to say we're better and we don't have these problems, and then realize, oh wait, they're underlying just as bad as they are there. But we are not, I'm glad, look, Kim's Convenience, I'm so glad Kim's Convenience exists. But you know how I heard about Kim's Convenience? Americans told me it was on Netflix, and they were like, oh, have you seen this Kim's Convenience? They don't know it's Canadian. They know it's Kim's Convenience. It's a great show. And they binge it. And I was like, oh, how did I, living in Canada, not know it? And granted, I moved here, but like, how did I not know Kim's Convenience is a show that's made here, very much Canadian? And why do we have these one-offs and these outliers of this happened, that happened? When reality, we should have tons. We should have South Asian for the sake of us, but like multicultural. We should have sketch comedy out there. We should have dramas out there. We should have comedies, sitcoms, all that. But when I've heard year after year stories of people pitching these to Bell, to Rogers, to whoever, and they basically just go like, oh, it's interesting. How has not one project materialized? Even if I always say, cancel me after 3 episodes. It's a catch-22. We don't have the viewership. Great. It's the audience's fault. But you tried. Why aren't you trying? Don't blame the audience for not coming out for content you are not even bothering to attempt.
Yeah, that sentiment is certainly appreciated. We'll wrap up there. And, the last thing that I'll say is that I think that with filmmakers like yourselves, with more female filmmakers, females representing, the polyglot, pluralistic society that Canada is, the US is, the world is becoming so much more global. And I think that when all of you, Ali, you're already a gatekeeper to a certain extent. Sammy, I have no doubt that you will be more so, just scaring yourself as well. I think that things are in good hands with people like you, who hopefully will be the future gatekeepers. And I want to thank Ali Kazmi, Sammy Khan, and Jaskiran Singh so much for joining us. And we'll sign off on that. Thanks so much.
Well, there you had it, folks. A wonderful day and incredible way to start off the week on BMO IFFSA. Thank you very much for being a part of today. Tomorrow, we have an incredible Tuesday lined up with lots of great films and great discussions. The theme tomorrow is frame of mind. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a wonderful